Hi, folks. This is Dee Scher with OASIS. It is my honor to present James Cabe. James was born in the Secret City, and I'm not going to tell you what that is. You can type it in the chat box if you figured it out. If not, we'll tell you in the end. James spent his early career in Cambridge, Massachusetts, working for BBN Planet. In 2000, he set course for New York and private network consulting for data security for legal firms, commodity trading networks, and large global retailers. From 2003, oil and gas operations in deep water and international locations made up the better part of the next decade. In 2010, James began working for Fortinet as a subject matter expert and evangelist for mega corporation security architecture, encryption, and next generation security, then assisted an industrial cybersecurity firm, CyberX, which was later purchased by Microsoft. James currently is at Armis Cybersecurity as an evangelist and speaker at security conferences such as Black Hat. All that to tell you that he's very qualified for what he's going to speak about today. He's going to discuss some recent findings related to incident response that indicates where many of the new generation of attacks are going, what attack surfaces they are seeking, some new tactics and strategies, and some ideas that will be required for defense. And with that, James, take it away. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Dee. I really appreciate it. That was a great introduction. So I do want to preface by saying some of the stuff that I'm going to say here is complete speculation on my part. And it's just me looking into the crystal ball of what I've done presently when I was having to help deal with incident response when it came to what I was dealing with in my previous position. So I just came off of CyberX, which is now Azure Defender for IoT. So some of what I was doing was actually industrial control systems and critical infrastructure. And what I did there is essentially I enabled the field. I did a bunch of training, did an OT to IT convergence training, and you can actually see those on YouTube. I think Microsoft has them out now if you're interested in knowing really the differences between OT and IT. But today the discussion is going to be a little bit behind what we're dealing with in attacks, as well as where I kind of see it going and what you might be able to do about some of these things. Some programs you can start now, because one of the great things about open source infrastructure, especially open source security, is it allows you to kind of test the waters when you get a very specific kind of technology and you know it's actually coming to fruition or to maturity when they are when you see them have open source versions as well, right? That get deployed in the field or have code readily available. I'm now a researcher and evangelist for Armis Cyber. Armis is an IoT cyber defense company. They also do operational technology as well. And that's the reason why I came on board, is to kind of assist the market in that general direction. I'll be generally being on the East Coast mostly, as well as the Central whenever it dealt with, because I currently reside in Houston, Texas. I've had 25 years of cybersecurity experience, going all the way back to working on Autonomous System 1, which was BBN Planet, which essentially was the first internet backbone ever, and where we were dealing with Fraggle attacks and things like that we crossed the network, as well as IRC reflection attacks that happened at the universities. And this was very early on. We were using super duper sophisticated stuff like net flow sorting, using Perl scripts, which was really, really bad and really, really slow, until I had some friends who are with very, very large companies now actually built binaries for us to do the same exact thing. So a flow sort used to take 2 days and ended up being in as little as 30 seconds. So just to let you know, I really truly believe in software and the power of it, as well as actually knowing exactly how a sort works, as bubble sorts versus anything else real. So talking about reality. This was one of the comics that I loved. A good friend of mine, researcher Amar Lakhani, who's still with Fortinet, likes leading with one of these slides. And it's really about perception, right? Because if you look at this, it's pretty funny if you're an adult, right? If you're a kid, you probably think of it a little bit differently. because at first, the mom had to come back and write the school when the kid brought the picture that day about who they were most proud of, was specifically, the child said his mom, and that was because his mom had this story about how she worked at Home Depot, and the child, heard the story from mom about a blizzard and how she was trying to help people out, and they were very, very frightened, and they'd actually sold out of all the shovels, and everybody was actually throwing money at her for the very, very last shovel. So it's very funny that she had to write this back, perception versus reality being a very big problem when you deal with cybersecurity, because you go into movies, which is the reason why I like starting with the slide I did, and you would think that cybersecurity is super duper, dare I say, sexy, and really, really super neat, and really it's just filled with nerds who like to fiddle with motherboards and computing stuff and get on the internet. And that's essentially where I started. I actually had an IBM PC Junior when I started, and then ended up with a 386 after mowing a bunch of lawns and doing some lifeguarding. And that's what I went to school with, and had to install WinSock on that machine just to get it up on anything that would look like a network at all. Back in the day, we used to have BBSs or bulletin board systems. So I go back a little way, quite a bit. Now there's going to be some questions showing up in chat. I'm going to try to get through my slides because I ramble sometimes too much and I don't leave enough time for questions. So I'm going to take all the questions at the end. I'm going to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. So make sure they fill up there. I apologize if I don't get to them quickly enough, but I'll definitely go through all of them. So not much is changing with the attacks. Right now, we're still dealing with a lot of ransomware that was new about 2 years ago. Phishing is still a gigantic part of our BEC now, which you call business email compromise, and drive-by downloads being another easy way, watering hole attacks and stuff like that. That's still the majority of the attacks we're still seeing today. That's not really where the attacks are transforming at. And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. The way in still hasn't really changed all that much if you're dealing with remote. If you're dealing with physical in-person hacks, that world is changing very, very quickly. And it started almost 2 or 3 years ago at Hacker Summer Camp, both at Black Hat and DEF CON, where there was a bunch of really good presentations about social engineering. And those people are luminaries now simply because they were able to teach a greater majority of pen testers exactly how to accomplish something with very, very little, because physical in-person hacks were usually, very, very risky. So this person taught, way to do it with very, very little risk, exactly how to report and work with the companies. And that goes a very long way to people that call them white hats, gray hats, red hats, whatever you'd like to call them, in that sort of thing, depending on who gets paid and who's not getting paid. There's somebody that I know, there's a good friend of mine says there's no such thing as a white hat. And I actually sort of tend to agree with them, because you're either getting paid and you're a good guy, or you're getting paid and you're a bad guy nowadays. So there's really no white hats, black hats. It seems to be pretty much all red hats and on two sides of cybercrime, right? And the word hacker is meaningless anymore anyway. It originally started back in the old days when we were dealing with code and writing, papers actually went back and forth, right? It was, like if you're going to write something, and you still, text from somebody, you're a hack. That's exactly what hacking came from. So it's always funny to see people that, have the hoodies and everything else like that calling people hackers, when really they are cyber criminals. And there's a gigantic set of organizations behind this now, which is the reason why it is actually transforming as fast as it is. We've dealt with QA portions of different types of cybercrime enablement services. The services were a big deal maybe 3 to 4 years ago. Now it's about affiliation programs and how you can actually get in. The biggest amount of these sorts of things, the affiliations, is where a lot of people are actually making quite a bit of the money at this point in time. And that's really where a lot of your ransomware comes in, because the ransomware platforms don't really change that much. And that's really where some of the most interesting parts of cyber security is right now, is being able to do at least attribution back to a specific APT. And you'll see a lot of that work done at a MITRE, or if you're British, the Mitre, But MITRE actually does a lot of this particular kind of work, tracking those organizations that are behind a lot of the cybercrime, cybercrime organizations and the specific attackers themselves. But crimeware producers are actually even people that mean well at this point in time, because we know that Cobalt Strike was actually being used for very, very bad things. There's a bunch of cybersecurity researchers like myself, when we first saw Cobalt Strike, that I was like, man, this is going to get used by bad people very, very quickly. And indeed, it was found in a bunch of attack packages later on, much to the chagrin of the people who created it, when they really had only the best intentions initially. The thing fueling all of this, of course, is the money exchanges. As Bitcoin has risen, even though in the past week or so, we've seen it fall down to $30,000 again. The Bitcoin exchanges, when I originally had this slide, was only at 20,000. And this was maybe 5 to 6 years ago when I first created the slide. This has only increased now, especially as we've seen, a pop of inflation. We will probably see Bitcoin rise again or something similar to it. I think crypto cash is here to stay. Just what forms those things take on will be a bit of a conversation afterwards. One of the biggest problems right now is mining will always be a problem, as well as speed of transaction. It's funny enough, a place where I go shopping for groceries here recently just announced their support of Bitcoin ATMs actually at their site. So even the regular grocery shopping stores are now starting to get in on Bitcoin. So as we said, a lot of that is changing very, very quickly, and it's enabled really by cryptocurrency. And this is exactly how it works. If you're not already aware, the exchange is fairly different, because you can actually use two different. You can actually have your own wallet that's registered, inside the blockchain. Or you can actually go with a trading house. The big problems with those is that they tend to be hacked quite a bit. Not much you can do about that, because you have to make those wallets publicly available when you do a transaction to actually be able to transact. So that's the reason why most people have use these particular trading systems, because you can have something that's like 20 to 25 wallets that can actually hide the money and do the transaction in an automated format to where you don't actually see where it's going. So it's almost like having the old Swiss bank account back in the day, or a set of bank accounts that would actually be able to route the money very, very quickly over the SWIFT networks. You basically got the same exact thing, but you've got cryptography basically built into it at this point. All right. How do people get to the stuff? How do they take a look at it? Where are the markets at? Well, this is actually a fairly old slide at this point. A lot of it people said was on the dark web. I find there's way more on the deep web. And the definitions of those are pretty simple. The open web is anything searchable by any kind of search engine. If you have a do not track and you have HTTPS encryption on your website, especially TLS 1.3, and you're still findable in the DNS records, of course, so people can usually still find you if they know what they're doing. But the deep web is highly unsearchable in a lot of ways. So you'll see a lot of people pouring through DNS zone transfers and things like that to find the stuff to get to it. And then, of course, there's a couple of drop zones and stuff like that if you know where to go. And you're really good at open source intelligence or OSINT. You can find a lot more on the deep web than you can actually find on the dark web. But there are search engines there, as well as social media, even both on the deeper webs, as well as the dark web. And the deeper webs, I mean stuff like Mastodon and those private social media networks. So there's a lot of those around. See where I'm at on time. So indicators of what's coming. What do I see? And this is all coming from my own experience in incident response. And so let me go over what we do in incident response initially. And so you know that I actually have a little bit of experience doing these sorts of things. Incident response is very fraught. It's a huge issue because the thing you're usually using to communicate has been compromised. So there's a lot of out-of-band management communication after this that actually has to be trackable because you have evidentiary chains that have to remain intact. So recording and logging everything you do, making sure you've got a digital fingerprint on most of those communications. That's very, very tough. So there are messaging systems that actually make this very, very possible, and even have the communications where both people have digital fingerprints on them, whether that be using PGP through email and another private email courier or machine that's also encrypted, or just doing something like secure messaging platforms that have basically crypto built in on both sides, including digital fingerprints for the actual individuals doing the communications that get authenticated when you're communicating. So all that's very, very required. Setting up an out-of-band communication to make all this stuff work. And then notifications go out to everybody. So once you've got that information set up and the members on that incident response team, and that also includes management as well, basically a war room is set up and designated for drops of information. So very, very important that communications can be made, and business decisions can also be made, whether that be shutting down a plant or a pipeline or anything else. If you feel like it's been compromised or could have been compromised and you don't have visibility into it. And that's half of what I usually preach, is having visibility into these situations. That's the reason why we've seen some of the shutdowns we have lately, simply because of those particular problems where you had the no CMs, certain portions of the company got breached, whether that be unintentional or not, using shadow IT. And all of a sudden, after you get breached, a search engine of something like Shodan.io finds an opening in your defenses, and then someone pops in and then they take control of something like, industrial control systems or a supervision workstation that has adjacent access to industrial control systems. And since you didn't see if there's any kind of programming command sent across, you will never know whether or not something was actually changed. So sometimes you have to shut that down and then launch forensics into it. That becomes a very, very big problem. And the root cause analysis afterwards is usually actually fairly simple. Most people think that's super duper complicated. But finding root cause analysis is really just log management. So make sure you're doing your logs and backups, and usually it makes stuff like that fairly simple. And that's some very, very easy hygiene for everybody here to do. So one of the recent vulnerability findings that we actually had, or I had myself on a team, is when we went to a company that does a lot of manufacturing, specifically around food, and they wanted to just have a regular old audit. And this audit, unfortunately, because we found something, turned into an incident response. So we hate to see that. We don't like to see it, but we usually ask them, especially if you're dealing with operational technology or critical infrastructure type stuff like industrial control systems, where you actually have a cyber physical component, people can be hurt, you have safety systems and things like that. We always ask them if they actually have incident response contracts with another company. And usually we'll get a yes, because that's very easily contracted at this point in time, especially if you're dealing with large companies. And they usually have this demanded by their own insurance. The problem is insurance still has a fairly blind eye whenever it comes to some of those industrial control systems and the incident response pieces for that sort of thing. So it's one of the things that we always have to mandate and be very specific about, especially with our partners who did not ask the customer whether that had somebody to deal with the operational technology side too, since it is so very different from the IT systems themselves. So understanding that's extremely hard to deal with. And when you're getting caught with, flat-footed and didn't know it, then that can become a big problem. And I believe that's what happened in the case of pipelines and packing companies and things along those lines. We identified the malware. It was actually a fairly old style worm. That was the initial thing we saw with the double pulsar backdoor. And it was getting around to every one of the systems that actually had to do with industrial control systems. So we were seeing lots of port scan detected. And the most troubling thing was we saw unauthorized PLC programming uploads to some of the industrial control systems. And that ended up being the biggest, scariest thing about this incident response. Is when we saw that, we knew there was a big problem. It got escalated up very, very quickly, and they came back down and said, okay, who's going to take care of that OT stuff? And we said, well, we've got a team, that we can float in. They said, well, how much? And we said, free, because Microsoft is really, really cool like that. So so they did. They flew them in, got the contracts done, did all the legal matters and everything else like that. We provided for the safety of the team. They had to go and deploy locally because we had to shut down portions of the plant to not completely shut down the plant all at the same time. And so they were able to maintain operations and actually figure out that the PLC uploads was actually just an errant computer ultimately. And, that was actually had a corrupted program on it that just kept attempting stuff and it didn't ever actually happen. So I wouldn't say it was a false positive because there were definitely attempts to upload new programming logic to those PLCs, but ultimately it had no impact because it was essentially re-uploading it again. The biggest problem we had was when we first contacted them, they already had an IT troubleshooting company come in over the top of what we were doing. And we said, hey, look, this is what you've got going on. They said, great, we're going to go take care of it. And so they did very, very quickly. Well, when we saw them doing this, they were cleaning off the machines. And we said, well, you might hit a tripwire. Are you sure that these people know what they're doing whenever it comes to, because we see them just go in and shut down machines and start trying to run incident response and mitigation or remediation on them. And when they did, they said, "Oh no, we got this. We have a great team, that was, can handle these sorts of things." And we said, "Great," because they were starting to segment the network and they seemed to be doing all the right things. Right in the middle of it, after they got most of the workstations taken care of that were part of the original infection, we started seeing weird HTTP header checks coming through over the deep packet inspection we were taking a look at. And this seemed to actually be a brand new CNC. And it was an entirely brand new set of workstations that were adjacent and not segmented at the time. So it seemed that they had basically tripped a logic bomb or a tripwire inside inside one of the malwares, and then all of a sudden the malware itself moved laterally. So that wasn't even a human operated situation where they were moving lateral, which is usually what we've seen up to this point, which is this kind of human operated malware campaigns where they get the joysticks and then they start moving laterally inside the organization. It's sort of human operated. This one was actually more logic bombs that we saw in a bunch of worms back in the day, maybe about 10 years ago. We saw some of these that were around that had time flavored logic bombs on them, and fortunately sandboxes took care of those. This actually had to do with more of it almost seemed to be a logic of, hey, this thing got removed and it had more checks for elsewhere inside the organization to make sure it was a wider incident response. And then after that, they kicked off a lateral movement that actually opened up a brand new command and control infrastructure that started trying to reach outbound. Luckily, they had all internet connectivity shut off at this point. If they had not, they would have actually had a much worse time of it. So it was really, really interesting what happened with the logic bombs. And the only thing that really saved them was the cutting off of internet connectivity until we were completely sure that everything was remediated and perfected, essentially. So all this was possible, seeing all this stuff from something called an NBAD, or Network Behavior and Anomaly Detection Appliance. And this does deep packet inspection without actually being on the wire or inside the wires themselves to actually stop packets. This actually had to do with something that no malware could possibly see. There was no next generation firewall in there. And this really helped out with a lot of the east-west issues we started seeing, especially when you saw the lateral movement and the brand new CNC that got spun up because of it. We were only able to see those sorts of things because of one of those NBAD appliances that were in there at the time. Ultimately, it ended up being two different other malwares that were actually in there, two different essentially worm-like malwares. One was Raindrop Rebellion, and the other one was Emotet. Both of them use kind of an encrypted API layer that actually uses HTTP to seem innocuous, but they actually encrypt the data themselves using a hashing algorithm. It's not really encrypted. It's hashed as it goes across. So you don't really see the commands that are going on. They truncate the HTTP protocol. So it seems like dropped TCP sessions. So nobody really pays much attention to it. And that was really mostly the Emotet piece. And because Emotet could not reach a CNC server, it was never able to transform into a full-blown attack. So these slides will be available after this. If you want to go take a look closer into it to find out what we found, these slides will be available. So what did we see change in an attack? Well, I'm going to use MITRE ATT&CK because I love it. I believe in everything MITRE is doing around this sort of thing. They're a fantastic resource. Otis with the OT side of the house. I worked with him a little bit at Fortinet, or the Fortinet team did. A little bit again, the CyberX team, including David Atch, worked with him a little bit later on the MITRE ATT&CK framework for industrial control systems, because they forked the attack frameworks a little bit between IT and OT. And even now there's more forks of this whenever it comes to shift left stuff, containerized systems and things along those sorts of path. So there's even more, because those are such different infrastructures from each other: shift left, industrial control systems, and your typical IT stuff. Where we really saw the changes and exactly what's going on with the attacks and how they're transforming is really their resource development. The logic bombs were very, very different. Closing down the number of workstations as opposed to expanding the number of workstations that were initially compromised or breached was fairly novel for us. And then only spreading later on. That was very, very quiet of them. The logic bombs being actually on some of those other machines that they had actually passed the not PETCHIT, well, it really was not PETCHIT, it was that back door that they were using to get into the SMB protocol. So one of the things that you can actually do that they use very heavily in that particular campaign, please, no more SMB v1 anymore. That's very doable via group policy objects. I realize that some industrial control systems might require this because they only support very, very, very old encryption. I would tell you, connecting it directly to a next generation firewall that would actually be able to see a downgrade attack and not a session initiation at SMB1 would be something to put there if you had to protect those particular systems. And I would directly connect them to those next generation firewalls.
We need to start wrapping up. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's go ahead. Yeah, we're running out a lot of time. So we're going to do this a little bit. So persistence, evasion, and the C2 and the exfils were some of the biggest changes we saw in that particular framework. So what can we do real quick? My suggestions for everybody, besides some very, very basic hygiene behind SMB1 and some group policy management, MFA, and all the rest of the stuff that they say is basic hygiene, is I would really start looking into deception for people. And deception could be something as simple as something like canary tokens or something along those lines, where you have specific user accounts that you're watching, as well as PEM keys that you make open and available, and you watch who accesses those crypto keys, and then even have an outside service monitor, that sort of thing, to make sure if those keys are robbed or you have them as canary tokens, that they're being washed externally as well, because a lot of thieves will actually start using those crypto keys externally to try to get into SaaS services that you're also using. And then starting exploring what it means to actually be zero trust. Zero trust is not a specific product. So let me warn everybody of that. Zero trust is a way of doing things, which really goes in with the ethos of open cybersecurity. There is open inception and deception stuff out there nowadays. Canary tokens was one of them. I believe smokescreen.io has a really good post of exactly what is open source out there for deception. So you can start dipping your toe in without any kind of issues there. Zero trust itself, Microsoft has a bunch of really good resources on this and about how to actually manage a zero trust program. So we're at the very end. I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to answer. So let me take a look at it.
We need to let folks go to the next session. So what I have done is I have asked them to send me their questions, and I will forward them to you. Is that okay?
Sounds perfect. Thank you so much.
Awesome. This was so interesting. Thank you, James. We appreciate it. Thanks everybody for attending.